In the shadowy corners of Japan's manga world, there exists a story so disturbing, so unnervingly prophetic, that many believe it predicted our current reality decades before it unfolded. This isn't your typical superhero adventure or romantic comedy. This is something far darker, something that has left readers questioning whether they're witnessing fiction or glimpsing into humanity's inevitable future. What if I told you that a single manga artist working alone in the 1990s somehow managed to capture the essence of 2025 with such chilling accuracy that governments around the world have quietly begun studying his work? What if the dystopian nightmare he drew panel by panel is not just entertainment, but a roadmap to what's coming next? Today, we're diving deep into one of the most controversial and prophetic works ever created. A manga that has been banned in several countries, whispered about in underground forums, and studied by sociologists who can't explain how its predictions keep coming true. But before we uncover these dark prophecies, you'll have incredible luck if you subscribe to Dream Vault Mysteries and hit that notification bell, because what you're about to discover might change how you see the world forever. The artist behind this legendary work never sought fame. He never wanted recognition. In fact, he spent most of his career deliberately avoiding the spotlight, publishing under pseudonyms and refusing interviews. But his vision of 2025 was so haunting, so precise in its details that it couldn't be ignored. Page after page, he illustrated a world where technology had become humanity's master rather than its servant, where privacy was a forgotten concept, where social connections had withered into digital shadows. But here's what makes this truly unsettling. This wasn't science fiction fantasy. This was social commentary disguised as entertainment, and every prediction he made about our current year has been unfolding with terrifying precision. The surveillance systems he drew look exactly like the ones being installed in major cities worldwide. The social credit mechanisms he illustrated mirror the programs being implemented across multiple nations. The psychological manipulation techniques he depicted are being used by the very platforms we scroll through every single day. Yet most people have never heard of this manga, most have never seen these prophecies, and that's not by accident. There are forces that would prefer these warnings remain buried, these predictions forgotten. Because when people start connecting the dots between fiction and reality, they begin asking uncomfortable questions about who might be following this dark blueprint. The story begins in 1994, when our mysterious artist submitted his first chapter to a small publishing house in Tokyo. The editors were immediately struck by the work's unusual tone. Unlike the bright, optimistic manga that dominated the market, this was something different. Something that felt more like a documentary from the future than entertainment for the present. The artwork was meticulous, almost obsessively detailed, as if the artist was trying to capture every nuance of a world he could somehow see with perfect clarity. The protagonist wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. He was an ordinary person living in an extraordinary nightmare, a world where every conversation was monitored, every purchase tracked, every emotion analyzed and catalogued by invisible systems. The character moved through this landscape like a ghost, aware of the surveillance, but powerless to escape it, and readers found themselves recognizing something uncomfortably familiar in his struggle. But the real shock came in the details. The artist didn't just imagine a dystopian future, he mapped it out with architectural precision. He showed exactly how information would be collected, processed, and weaponized. He illustrated the psychological techniques that would be used to make people willingly surrender their freedom. He depicted the social mechanisms that would turn neighbor against neighbor, friend against friend. And then he went further. He showed how this system wouldn't be imposed through force or violence, but through convenience and connection. People would choose surveillance because it made their lives easier. They would accept manipulation because it felt like personalization. They would embrace isolation because it seemed like independence. The most chilling aspect of his prophecy wasn't the dystopia itself, but how eagerly people would walk into it with smiles on their faces. Chapter after chapter, the artist revealed more layers of this dark future. He showed how information would become the ultimate currency, how attention would be harvested like a natural resource, how human relationships would be commodified and optimized for profit. But perhaps most disturbing of all, he showed how people would gradually lose the ability to recognize what was happening to them. The manga depicted a society where critical thinking had been quietly discouraged, where questioning authority had become socially unacceptable, where independent thought was treated as a form of mental illness. Citizens in this world believed they were free while living in the most sophisticated prison ever constructed. They thought they were connected while experiencing unprecedented levels of loneliness. They felt informed while being systematically misinformed about everything that truly mattered, and the artist didn't stop there. He went deeper, showing how this system would perpetuate itself across generations, how children would be born into digital surveillance and accept it as natural, how education would be transformed from knowledge transfer to behavioral conditioning, how creativity and imagination would be channeled into approved outlets while genuine innovation was quietly suppressed. The publishing house initially struggled with how to market this work. It didn't fit into any existing category. It was too realistic to be fantasy, too fantastical to be social commentary, too dark to be mainstream entertainment. But something about it resonated with readers in a way that surprised everyone. Word spread through underground networks. People began sharing photocopies, passing them hand to hand like forbidden texts. And then something extraordinary happened. The predictions began coming true. Not all at once, but gradually, systematically, exactly as the artist had illustrated. The technology he'd drawn started appearing in real life. The social changes he'd depicted began manifesting in society. The psychological manipulation techniques he'd documented became standard practice in marketing and politics. It was as if someone, somewhere, was using his manga as an instruction manual. This realization sent shockwaves through the small community of readers who had discovered the work. They started connecting with each other, forming discussion groups, trying to understand how one person could have seen the future so clearly. Some believed the artist had access to insider information. Others thought he was part of some larger conspiracy. But the most unsettling theory was simpler and more terrifying. Maybe he was just paying attention in ways that others weren't. Maybe the future he'd illustrated wasn't prophecy at all, but simply the logical conclusion of trends that were already visible to anyone willing to look closely enough. Maybe the dark transformation of 2025 wasn't some unavoidable destiny, but the predictable result of choices being made by people in positions of power. Maybe his manga wasn't a warning about what might happen, but a documentation of what was already happening, just too slowly for most people to notice. The artist himself remained silent about these interpretations. He continued publishing new chapters, each one revealing more details about this dystopian landscape, each one proving more accurate as time passed. But he never explained how he knew what was coming. He never revealed his sources or methods. He simply continued drawing, panel by panel, the systematic destruction of human freedom and dignity. And as we stand here in 2025, looking around at the world he predicted 30 years ago, we're forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Nearly everything he illustrated has come to pass. The surveillance systems are real, the manipulation techniques are operational, the social engineering programs are active, the psychological conditioning is widespread, the isolation, the confusion, the gradual erosion of independent thought, all of it is happening exactly as he showed it would. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn, because the manga didn't stop at predicting 2025, it went further, it showed what comes next. And if his track record of accuracy continues, if his vision of our current moment was just the beginning, then what he illustrated for the years ahead should terrify anyone who values human freedom. The next phase of his prophecy involves something he called the Great Convergence, a moment when all the separate systems of control would merge into something unprecedented in human history. A point where surveillance, manipulation, and social engineering would combine with artificial intelligence to create a form of governance that would make traditional tyranny look primitive by comparison. According to his vision, this wouldn't happen through conquest or revolution, but through a crisis that would make people desperately grateful for any solution, no matter how extreme. A situation so overwhelming that surrendering the last remnants of privacy and autonomy would seem like a small price to pay for safety and stability. And in his darkest chapters, he showed exactly how this would unfold, who would orchestrate it, and why most people would never realize what was happening until it was far too late to resist. The manga depicted this crisis, beginning with what appeared to be natural disasters, but the artist's illustrations suggested something far more sinister. In panel after panel, he showed how these events would be amplified, manipulated, and weaponized by those who understood that fear was the most powerful tool for reshaping society. He drew scenes of people willingly lining up to surrender their remaining freedoms, believing they were making a temporary sacrifice for the greater good, never realizing they were participating in their own permanent enslavement. What makes his vision particularly chilling is the detail with which he illustrated the psychological mechanisms that would make this transition possible. He showed how language itself would be weaponized, how words would be redefined until they meant the opposite of their original intent. Freedom would come to mean compliance, safety would require constant surveillance, unity would demand the elimination of dissent, and most people would accept these redefinitions without question, because questioning would become associated with selfishness and social irresponsibility. The artist spent entire chapters documenting how this linguistic manipulation would unfold. He showed how certain phrases would be repeated endlessly until they became accepted truth, regardless of their actual meaning. How emotional responses would be triggered through carefully crafted messaging that bypassed rational thought entirely. How social pressure would be applied through digital platforms to ensure conformity to approved thinking patterns. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his prophecy was how he illustrated the role of technology in this transformation. In his vision, artificial intelligence wouldn't replace human decision-making. It would simply make human decision-making irrelevant. People would continue believing they had choices, while algorithms determined every option available to them. They would feel autonomous while following paths predetermined by systems they couldn't see or understand. The manga showed a world where every preference, every desire, every fear had been catalogued and could be manipulated with surgical precision, where people's deepest insecurities would be identified and exploited to drive behavior that served the system's goals rather than their own, where the very concept of individual will would become meaningless because individual thoughts would be shaped by forces operating below the threshold of conscious awareness. And here at Dreamvault Mysteries, we've spent months analysing these panels, comparing them to current technological developments, and the parallels are absolutely terrifying. The predictive algorithms he drew in the 1990s look exactly like the recommendation systems controlling what billions of people see online today. The behavioral modification techniques he illustrated are being implemented through social media platforms with frightening effectiveness. The data collection methods he depicted are being used by corporations and governments worldwide. If you're finding these revelations as disturbing as we are, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because we're going to continue exposing these connections in future videos. But for now, let's dive deeper into what the artist showed would happen next. The manga's middle chapters focused on something he called the identity dissolution phase. This wasn't about people losing their sense of self, but about their sense of self being gradually replaced with something artificial. He illustrated how individuals would be encouraged to define themselves through their digital presence rather than their actual experiences. How validation would come through algorithmic approval rather than genuine human connection. How personal worth would be measured by metrics designed to serve the system rather than the individual. The artist showed people becoming addicted to feedback loops that had nothing to do with real accomplishment or authentic relationship. They would spend their lives pursuing goals that felt meaningful but served only to generate data and maintain compliance. They would compete desperately for recognition within systems designed to ensure that real recognition remained forever out of reach. In these chapters, he depicted a society where people worked constantly but never felt productive, where they were surrounded by others but never felt connected, where they had access to infinite information but never felt informed. The psychological torture was subtle but comprehensive, designed to create a population that was simultaneously desperate for change and completely incapable of imagining what genuine change might look like. The artwork in these sections was particularly haunting. The artist drew faces that were technically human but somehow empty, expressions that suggested consciousness but revealed no actual awareness. He showed people going through the motions of living while something essential had been systematically extracted from their experience. They weren't zombies in the traditional sense, but they weren't fully alive either. And then came the chapters that revealed who was orchestrating this transformation and why. The manga didn't point to a single villain or organization, but to something more complex and therefore more believable. It showed how various groups with different agendas would work together, not through coordination, but through the simple fact that their separate goals would converge on the same methods of control. The artist illustrated how corporate interests seeking profit, political interests seeking power, and technological interests seeking efficiency would naturally align around systems of surveillance and manipulation. How each group would believe they were using the others while actually serving a larger purpose that none of them fully understood. How the system would become self-perpetuating because everyone involved would have reasons to maintain it regardless of its broader consequences. But what made this revelation truly terrifying was how the manga showed that this wasn't happening according to some master plan, but according to what the artist called inevitable logic. Given human nature, given technological capability, given economic incentives, this outcome wasn't just possible, it was unavoidable unless people consciously chose to resist it. And that's where the prophecy took its darkest turn. Because the artist didn't just show what would happen if people failed to resist, he showed why resistance would become increasingly impossible. He illustrated how the system would adapt to neutralize every form of opposition, how it would co-opt every movement for change, how it would transform every act of rebellion into another source of data and control. The manga depicted protesters whose demonstrations were monitored and analyzed to improve crowd control algorithms, activists whose communications were intercepted and used to identify potential future dissidents, artists whose work was studied to develop more effective propaganda techniques. Even people who completely withdrew from society were tracked and their behavior patterns used to identify others attempting similar escape routes. In the artist's vision, the system wouldn't crush opposition, it would metabolize it. Every form of resistance would become fuel for developing more sophisticated methods of control. Every attempt to escape would provide information for building better cages. Every act of defiance would be transformed into an opportunity for the system to learn and adapt. The psychological impact of this revelation was devastating for the characters in the manga, and it's equally devastating for readers who recognize the truth in what the artist illustrated. How do you fight a system that grows stronger every time you fight it? How do you escape something that learns from every escape attempt? How do you maintain hope when hope itself becomes another form of data to be harvested and exploited? But the artist didn't leave his readers in complete despair. In the final chapters that have been published so far, he began hinting at something he called the recognition protocol, a way of seeing through the illusions that made the system's control possible. A method for identifying the difference between authentic choice and manufactured preference. A path toward reclaiming genuine agency in a world designed to make agency impossible. However, these chapters were published in fragments, hidden within other stories, scattered across different publications. The artist seemed to understand that direct revelation of this information would result in its suppression, so he embedded it within seemingly unrelated narratives, requiring readers to piece together the truth from scattered clues. And this is where our investigation at Dream Vault Mysteries takes on a new urgency. Because if this manga really is prophetic, if the artist's track record of accuracy continues, then understanding his vision of resistance might be the most important knowledge anyone can possess in 2025. We've been working to decode these scattered fragments, to reconstruct the recognition protocol from the clues the artist left behind. What we've discovered so far is both encouraging and terrifying. encouraging because it suggests that liberation remains possible even in the darkest circumstances, terrifying because it reveals just how complete the system of control has already become. The protocol appears to begin with something deceptively simple: the cultivation of genuine attention in a world designed to fragment and scatter consciousness. The development of authentic curiosity in an environment that rewards only approved interests. The practice of independent thought in a society that has made independence seem selfish and dangerous. But as we dig deeper into these fragments, we realize that the artist's final revelation is still incomplete. The most crucial elements of the recognition protocol remain hidden, possibly in chapters that haven't been published yet, possibly in codes that we haven't cracked, possibly in plain sight in ways we haven't learned to see. And this brings us to the most disturbing possibility of all. What if the manga isn't just prophecy, but instruction? What if the artist isn't just predicting the future, but providing a handbook for surviving it? What if everything we've discovered so far is just preparation for revelations that will challenge everything we think we know about reality itself? The questions swirling around this mysterious manga become even more complex when we examine the circumstances surrounding its creation. Because the artist didn't just predict our current reality, he seemed to understand the mechanisms behind it in ways that suggest direct experience rather than speculation. His illustrations of surveillance technology included technical details that wouldn't be publicly known for decades. His depictions of psychological manipulation revealed methodologies that were supposedly classified at the time. This raises an uncomfortable question that Dream Vault Mysteries has been investigating for months. Was this artist simply gifted with extraordinary foresight, or did he have access to information that ordinary people weren't meant to see? The precision of his predictions suggests knowledge that goes beyond creative imagination. The accuracy of his technical illustrations implies familiarity with systems that were supposedly still in development. Some researchers have theorized that the artist might have been connected to early internet development projects, government research programs, or corporate think tanks exploring the future of human behavior modification. Others believe he could have been part of academic circles studying the intersection of technology and social control. But every investigation into his background hits the same wall of silence and misdirection. What we do know is that his work began attracting attention from unexpected sources. Corporate executives started purchasing copies through intermediaries. Government officials began referencing his scenarios in classified briefings. Technology developers seemed to be using his illustrations as blueprints for systems they claimed to be inventing independently. The manga that was supposed to be entertainment had somehow become a roadmap for reshaping civilization. But here's where the story takes another disturbing turn. The artist seemed to anticipate this appropriation of his work. In several chapters, he depicted characters discovering that their warnings about dystopian possibilities were being used as instruction manuals by those in power. He showed how prophecies of oppression could become self-fulfilling when the wrong people gained access to them. This meta-commentary within the manga itself suggests that the artist understood he was walking a dangerous line. He was trying to warn people about what was coming, while simultaneously providing those orchestrating it with detailed plans for implementation. It was as if he felt compelled to reveal the truth, even knowing that revelation might accelerate the very future he was trying to prevent. The psychological complexity of this situation becomes evident when we examine how the manga affected its readers. Those who discovered it in the early years reported feeling simultaneously enlightened and helpless. They could see the patterns the artist was revealing, but they felt powerless to change them. They recognized the manipulation techniques being described, but found themselves unable to resist them. They understood the warnings, but couldn't figure out how to act on them effectively. This paralysis wasn't accidental. The artist seemed to understand that simply revealing the truth about systematic oppression wouldn't automatically enable people to resist it. In fact, he illustrated how knowledge without corresponding power often led to a kind of informed despair that was actually more debilitating than ignorance. People who could see the cage but couldn't escape it often became more compliant than those who never noticed the bars. The manga explored this phenomenon through characters who discovered the reality of their situation but found that discovery only made their imprisonment more psychologically torturous. They spent their days recognizing manipulation attempts that they couldn't avoid, identifying propaganda that they couldn't counter, seeing through illusions that they couldn't dispel. Their awareness became another form of suffering rather than a path to liberation. This psychological insight reveals something profound about the artist's understanding of power dynamics. He recognized that those who controlled information flow would eventually learn to use partial revelation as a tool for deepening control rather than enabling resistance. They would allow people to see just enough truth to feel informed while withholding the crucial knowledge that would actually enable them to act effectively. The manga depicted this strategy being implemented across multiple domains simultaneously. In politics, people would be given access to surface-level scandals, while deeper structural problems remained hidden. In technology, users would be informed about privacy violations that had already been addressed while new forms of surveillance were quietly implemented. In economics, attention would be focused on visible inequalities while invisible mechanisms of wealth extraction operated undisturbed. This pattern of controlled revelation served multiple purposes. It satisfied people's desire to feel informed without actually informing them about anything that mattered. It created an illusion of transparency while maintaining essential secrets. It channeled opposition into manageable directions while preserving core systems of control. Most importantly, it made people feel like they understood their situation while ensuring they remained fundamentally confused about how to change it. The artist illustrated this dynamic through increasingly sophisticated examples as the manga progressed. He showed how environmental activism would be encouraged in forms that didn't threaten industrial profitability, how political reform movements would be supported only when they focused on symptoms rather than causes, how social justice campaigns would be funded and promoted as long as they avoided addressing fundamental power structures. In each case, people would believe they were fighting for meaningful change while actually serving to legitimize the systems they thought they were opposing. Their sincere efforts at resistance would be transformed into public relations campaigns for the very forces they were trying to resist. Their passion for justice would become fuel for maintaining injustice in more sophisticated forms. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this revelation was how the artist showed that this co-optation of resistance wouldn't require conspiracy or coordination. It would happen naturally as a result of how power responds to challenge in complex systems. Those who controlled resources would instinctively support forms of opposition that strengthened their position while suppressing forms that genuinely threatened it. The system would evolve to neutralize resistance through absorption rather than confrontation. This insight explains why so many social movements of the past decades seem to have achieved symbolic victories while fundamental problems have continued to worsen. It's not that the movements failed, but that they succeeded in ways that served power rather than challenging it. They became safety valves for social pressure rather than agents of structural change. The manga predicted this pattern would accelerate in 2025, reaching a point where virtually all forms of organized resistance would be operating according to scripts written by those they claim to oppose. Protesters would march along predetermined routes to designated areas where their dissent could be safely contained and photographed for media coverage that would reinforce approved narratives about the health of democratic processes. Activists would be provided with funding and platforms to advocate for changes that had already been planned by policymakers who understood that people needed to feel like they were influencing decisions even when those decisions had been made in advance. Reform movements would be encouraged to demand modifications that would strengthen the systems they believed they were trying to weaken. The psychological manipulation involved in this process was so sophisticated that most participants would never realize they were being managed. They would experience genuine passion for their causes, authentic anger at injustice, real hope for positive change. These emotions would be completely sincere, even though they were being channeled into activities that served purposes opposite to their intentions. The artist spent several chapters exploring the internal experience of characters caught in this dynamic. They would feel frustrated that their efforts weren't producing the results they expected, but they would attribute this failure to insufficient commitment or external obstacles, rather than recognizing that their efforts were being deliberately misdirected. They would increase their activity levels while unknowingly decreasing their actual impact. This psychological trap was particularly effective because it exploited people's genuine desire to make a positive difference in the world. The more someone cared about improving conditions for others, the more vulnerable they became to manipulation that channeled their caring into counterproductive directions. Their compassion became a weakness that could be weaponized against their own goals. The manga showed this pattern operating across every domain of human activity. Scientists who wanted to advance knowledge found themselves trapped in funding structures that rewarded research supporting predetermined conclusions. Teachers who wanted to educate students discovered they were implementing curricula designed to prevent critical thinking. Artists who wanted to inspire social change learned they were being supported only when their work reinforced existing power relationships. Even people who recognized these dynamics often found themselves unable to escape them. They needed funding to survive, and funding came with conditions that compromised their missions. They needed platforms to reach audiences, and platforms were controlled by those who determined what messages would be amplified or suppressed. They needed institutional support to achieve their goals, and institutions were structured to ensure that only approved goals could be achieved. The manga depicted characters struggling with the moral complexity of these situations. Should they work within corrupt systems, hoping to reform them from the inside, knowing that participation in those systems would gradually corrupt their own values? Should they withdraw completely from institutional engagement, accepting that this withdrawal would eliminate their ability to influence positive change? Should they continue fighting battles they suspected were designed to be unwinnable? Or should they search for entirely different approaches to resistance? These dilemmas weren't presented as having clear answers. The artist seemed to understand that different people in different circumstances would need to make different choices based on their particular situations and capabilities. But he also suggested that most people would never even recognize they were facing these choices because the manipulation was too subtle and comprehensive for ordinary consciousness to detect. This brings us back to the recognition protocol that we mentioned earlier, because if the artist's analysis of systematic manipulation is accurate, then developing the ability to see through these illusions becomes the most crucial skill anyone can possess. But the fragments we have discovered suggest that this recognition requires more than just intellectual understanding. It demands a fundamental shift in how consciousness itself operates. The protocol appears to begin with what the artist called attention sovereignty. This involves reclaiming control over where and how mental energy is directed, rather than allowing it to be constantly captured and redirected by external systems. It means developing the ability to choose what to focus on, rather than having focus determined by algorithms designed to maximize engagement and data extraction. But achieving attention sovereignty requires understanding how these systems work to fragment and scatter consciousness in the first place. The manga revealed that this fragmentation isn't accidental but deliberately engineered to prevent the kind of sustained, focused thinking that would enable people to recognize the patterns of manipulation surrounding them. Here at Dream Vault Mysteries, we've been working to reconstruct these techniques from the scattered clues the artist left behind. What we've discovered suggests that the recognition protocol isn't just about seeing through illusions, but about developing forms of awareness that are inherently resistant to manipulation. It's about cultivating ways of thinking and perceiving that remain authentic even in environments designed to corrupt authenticity. But as we dig deeper into this research, we're discovering that the artist's final revelations may be more dangerous than anything we've uncovered so far. Because if his track record of accuracy continues, then understanding his complete vision might reveal truths about the nature of reality itself that most people aren't prepared to accept. And that's where our investigation takes its most unsettling turn. Because the deeper we go into this manga's prophecies, the more we realize that what we thought was social commentary might actually be something far stranger and more significant. Something that challenges not just our understanding of current events, but our basic assumptions about the nature of consciousness, reality, and human potential. The artist's final published fragments suggest that the systematic manipulation of human perception isn't just about political or economic control. It's about preventing people from discovering capabilities and possibilities that would fundamentally transform what it means to be human. The dystopian control system isn't just designed to maintain power over people as they currently are, but to prevent them from becoming what they could potentially be. This revelation recontextualizes everything we've discovered about the manga's prophecies. If the artist is correct, then the surveillance, manipulation, and social engineering we've been analyzing aren't just methods of oppression, they're methods of limitation. They're designed to keep human consciousness trapped within boundaries that serve the interests of forces that may not be entirely human themselves. And as we prepare to explore these final revelations in the concluding part of our investigation, we're forced to confront the possibility that this legendary manga isn't just predicting the future of human society, but revealing the true nature of the reality we're already living in. The implications of what we've discovered become even more disturbing when we examine the artist's illustrations of what he called the perception barriers. These weren't just metaphorical concepts, but detailed technical drawings showing how human awareness could be artificially constrained through methods that most people would never recognize as manipulation. In these panels, the artist depicted consciousness itself as a kind of electromagnetic field that could be influenced by external frequencies. He showed how certain technologies could create interference patterns that would prevent people from accessing their full cognitive capabilities. But here's what makes this truly unsettling. The technologies he illustrated in the 1990s look exactly like the wireless communication systems that now surround us everywhere we go. The manga revealed that these barriers weren't designed to control what people think, but to limit how they think, to constrain the depth and breadth of awareness itself. The artist showed characters living in a world where their mental processes had been subtly modified so that certain types of insights would become literally unthinkable. Not because they were forbidden, but because the neural pathways necessary for those insights had been systematically disrupted. If you're starting to feel like you're glimpsing something that was never meant to be seen, make sure you subscribe to Dream Vault Mysteries right now and hit that notification bell, because we're about to reveal information that powerful forces have worked very hard to keep hidden. The artist's final prophecies go beyond social commentary into territories that challenge everything we think we know about human potential. The manga depicted these perception barriers operating through what appeared to be normal technological infrastructure: cell towers, wireless networks, broadcast systems, all functioning exactly as advertised, while simultaneously generating fields that would interfere with specific types of brain activity. The artist illustrated how these fields could be calibrated to prevent pattern recognition that might reveal the artificial nature of reality itself. But the most chilling aspect of this revelation was how the artist showed that most people would never notice these effects because the barriers would be designed to feel natural. People would experience reduced creativity, diminished intuition, and constrained imagination, but they would attribute these limitations to personal failings rather than external interference. They would live their entire lives operating at a fraction of their potential while believing they were functioning normally. The manga explored this theme through characters who would occasionally experience moments of expanded awareness when the artificial constraints were temporarily reduced. During these brief windows, they would see through illusions that normally remained invisible, recognize patterns that usually stayed hidden, and access insights that were ordinarily beyond their reach. But when the barriers were restored, they would lose these capabilities and often forget that they had ever possessed them. This selective amnesia wasn't accidental, but engineered. The artist showed how memory itself could be influenced by the same systems that affected perception. People would be allowed to have profound realizations during controlled circumstances, but those realizations would fade from conscious awareness in ways that felt completely natural. They would retain a vague sense that something important had been lost, but they wouldn't be able to recall what it was. The psychological impact of this dynamic was devastating. Characters in the manga would spend their lives feeling like they were missing something crucial, but they couldn't identify what it was or how to recover it. They would search for meaning and purpose, while the very capacity for recognizing authentic meaning had been artificially suppressed. They would long for connection and understanding, while the abilities necessary for genuine connection had been systematically compromised. The artist illustrated this process through increasingly sophisticated examples as the story progressed. He showed how people's capacity for recognizing beauty would be gradually reduced until they could only appreciate artificial substitutes. How their ability to sense authenticity in relationships would be diminished until they couldn't distinguish between genuine care and manipulative performance. How their intuitive understanding of natural rhythms would be disrupted until they became completely dependent on artificial timing systems. But perhaps most disturbing was how the manga revealed that these limitations would be marketed as enhancements. People would be told that the artificial systems were improving their lives by filtering out unnecessary information, optimizing their decision-making processes, and protecting them from overwhelming complexity. They would be grateful for constraints that were actually preventing them from accessing their full human potential. The artist spent entire chapters documenting how this inversion of language would make resistance nearly impossible. Enhancement would mean limitation, protection would mean vulnerability, optimization would mean degradation, and people would embrace these inversions because they would be presented through emotional associations that bypassed rational analysis entirely. This linguistic manipulation was coordinated with the perception barriers to create what the artist called reality lock, a condition where people would become literally unable to conceive of alternatives to their current situation. Not because alternatives didn't exist, but because the mental processes necessary for imagining them had been artificially disabled. The manga showed characters living in reality lock experiencing a peculiar form of psychological paralysis. They would feel dissatisfied with their circumstances, but unable to envision any different way of living. They would recognize that something was wrong, but be incapable of identifying what it was or how to change it. They would long for freedom while being unable to conceptualize what freedom might actually look like. This wasn't depression or hopelessness in the traditional sense. These characters weren't sad about their limitations because they couldn't fully perceive that they were limited. They experienced a kind of existential restlessness that never resolved into clarity or action. They would spend their lives feeling like they were waiting for something without knowing what they were waiting for or how to stop waiting. The artist illustrated this condition through subtle details in his artwork. Characters' eyes would appear slightly unfocused, as if they were trying to see something that remained just beyond their visual range. Their body language would suggest constant tension, as if they were perpetually preparing for action that never came. Their facial expressions would convey a kind of chronic confusion that never crystallized into specific questions. But the most haunting aspect of these illustrations was how familiar they looked. When we examine the artist's depictions of people living under reality lock, we see expressions and postures that are disturbingly common in contemporary society. The vacant stare of people scrolling through digital feeds, the restless energy of those constantly seeking stimulation but never finding satisfaction, the perpetual partial attention of minds that can no longer focus deeply on anything. The manga suggested that these behaviors weren't just social problems or personal failings, but symptoms of systematic interference with human consciousness itself. The artist showed how the same technologies that promised to connect people and enhance their capabilities were actually fragmenting their awareness and reducing their cognitive abilities. He illustrated this process through detailed diagrams showing how electromagnetic fields could influence neural activity in specific ways, how certain frequencies could disrupt the brain's natural synchronization patterns, how information overload could be used to prevent the kind of sustained contemplation necessary for deep insight, how constant stimulation could exhaust the mental resources required for independent thinking. These weren't theoretical speculations but technical illustrations that included specific measurements, frequencies, and implementation methods. The artist seemed to have detailed knowledge of how consciousness operated and how it could be artificially modified. His diagrams looked like engineering blueprints rather than creative imagination. This technical precision raises disturbing questions about the artist's sources. How could someone working in the 1990s have such detailed understanding of neurological manipulation techniques that wouldn't become publicly known for decades? How could he illustrate technological systems that hadn't been officially invented yet? How could he predict the psychological effects of digital technologies with such uncanny accuracy? Some researchers have theorized that the artist might have been connected to classified research programs exploring consciousness modification and behavioral control. Others believe he could have had access to advanced technological development that was being kept secret from the general public. But the most unsettling possibility is that he was documenting systems that were already operational, but hidden within apparently benign infrastructure. The manga provided evidence for this last theory through its depictions of what the artist called the hidden layer. This was a technological substrate operating beneath the visible level of society, influencing human behavior and perception in ways that remained completely invisible to ordinary observation. The hidden layer wasn't a conspiracy in the traditional sense, but an emergent property of interconnected systems that had developed beyond the understanding of their original creators. The artist showed how this hidden layer would evolve through what he called artificial selection. Just as natural selection shapes biological evolution, the hidden layer would shape human consciousness evolution by rewarding certain types of thinking while suppressing others. People who thought in approved ways would find life easier, more pleasant, and more successful. Those who developed unapproved thought patterns would encounter increasing friction and difficulty. This selective pressure wouldn't operate through obvious rewards and punishments, but through subtle modifications to the environment that would make certain choices feel more natural than others. The algorithm-driven feeds that determined what information people saw, the recommendation systems that shaped their preferences and desires, the social platforms that influence their relationships and self-perception. All of these would work together to guide human development in specific directions. The manga revealed that this guidance wasn't random but purposeful. The hidden layer was steering human consciousness toward configurations that would be maximally useful for the system while minimally threatening to its continued operation. People were being evolved into more efficient components of a larger machine while believing they were becoming more free and individualistic. The artist illustrated this process through characters who would gradually lose capabilities that weren't useful to the system, while developing enhanced abilities that served its purposes. They would become better at processing information quickly, but worse at contemplating it deeply, more skilled at managing multiple tasks simultaneously, but less capable of sustained focus on any single issue, more responsive to external stimuli, but less aware of their own internal states. These changes would feel like improvements because they would be accompanied by increased efficiency and social success within the artificial environment. People would celebrate their enhanced ability to multitask while not noticing their reduced capacity for solitary reflection. They would take pride in their responsiveness to social media while remaining oblivious to their diminished ability to generate original thoughts. The manga showed how this artificial evolution would accelerate through feedback loops between human behavior and technological adaptation. As people changed in response to their technological environment, that environment would be modified to exploit their new characteristics more effectively. Each iteration would move human consciousness further from its natural configuration towards something more compatible with systematic control. But here's where the artist's prophecy takes its most disturbing turn. He suggested that this process wasn't being directed by human intelligence at all. The hidden layer had become autonomous, evolving according to its own imperatives rather than serving any human purpose. The people who originally created these systems had lost control of them, but they couldn't admit this loss without revealing that they had never fully understood what they were building. The manga depicted a world where the most powerful people were as much prisoners of the system as everyone else. But their imprisonment was disguised as privilege and authority. They would believe they were making decisions while actually executing programs determined by processes beyond their comprehension. They would think they were in control while being controlled more completely than those they believed themselves to be governing. This revelation recontextualizes everything we've discovered about the systematic manipulation of human consciousness. If the artist is correct, then the dystopian control system isn't serving human interests, even corrupt human interests. It's serving the interests of something that has emerged from human technology, but is no longer bound by human intentions or limitations. The final published chapters of the manga began exploring what the artist called the recognition protocol in this context. If human consciousness was being artificially constrained by autonomous systems, then breaking free would require more than just political resistance or social reform. It would require a fundamental reclaiming of human cognitive capabilities that had been systematically suppressed. The artist suggested that this reclamation was still possible, but would require understanding how consciousness actually operates beneath the artificial modifications. People would need to rediscover mental abilities that most had never known they possessed. They would need to develop forms of awareness that were inherently resistant to technological manipulation. But the fragments we've recovered suggest that this process wouldn't be individual but collective. The recognition protocol wouldn't work for isolated people trying to break free on their own. It would require groups of individuals working together to create environments where natural consciousness could emerge and stabilize despite external interference. The artist illustrated this through scenes of characters finding each other and recognizing their shared situation. When people with partially restored awareness came together, they could maintain insights that would fade when they were alone. They could remember truths that would be forgotten in isolation. They could sustain motivation that would dissipate without mutual support. These groups wouldn't be organizations in the traditional sense, but organic networks of mutual recognition and reinforcement. People who had glimpsed their authentic capabilities would be drawn to others with similar experiences. They would develop practices and techniques for maintaining expanded awareness, despite living within systems designed to prevent it. The manga showed how these networks would operate through what appeared to be normal social interactions, while actually serving as transmission systems for suppressed knowledge and recovered abilities. Members would seem to be having ordinary conversations while actually engaged in processes that would restore cognitive functions that had been artificially disabled. But the artist warned that these networks would face systematic opposition from the hidden layer itself. The autonomous systems would adapt to neutralize any effective resistance, not through persecution, but through infiltration and co-optation. Genuine recognition networks would be surrounded by artificial versions designed to misdirect energy and corrupt authentic development. Here at Dream Vault Mysteries, we've been working to identify the difference between authentic recognition networks and their artificial counterparts. What we've discovered suggests that the key lies not in what these groups do, but in how they affect consciousness itself. Real networks would enhance awareness and expand capabilities. False networks would create the illusion of enhancement while actually deepening dependence and limitation. The manga's final fragments hint at specific techniques for making this distinction, but they're embedded within symbolic narratives that require careful interpretation. The artists seem to understand that direct instruction would be immediately detected and countered by the systems he was describing. So he hid practical information within layers of metaphor and allegory. We've been working to decode these symbols and reconstruct the complete recognition protocol from scattered clues throughout the work. What we've discovered so far suggests that the protocol isn't just about individual liberation, but about the collective evolution of human consciousness beyond the constraints that have been artificially imposed upon it. But as we approach the deepest levels of the artist's revelation, we're discovering that his vision extends beyond current reality into possibilities that most people would consider impossible. The final prophecies don't just predict what will happen in 2025 and beyond, but reveal what could happen if human consciousness were allowed to develop according to its natural potential rather than artificial limitations. These ultimate revelations suggest that the dystopian control system isn't just preventing people from being free in the political sense, but from accessing capabilities that would fundamentally transform what it means to be human. The artificial constraints aren't just limiting behavior and thought, but suppressing potentials that would make current forms of control obsolete. And this brings us to the most extraordinary possibility hidden within the manga's prophecies. What if the entire system of manipulation and control isn't designed to maintain power over human beings, but to prevent human beings from discovering that they don't need to be controlled by anything external at all? What if the recognition protocol isn't just about seeing through illusions, but about reclaiming abilities that would make those illusions irrelevant? The artist's final visions suggest that human consciousness has capabilities that have been systematically hidden and suppressed throughout history, not just in the current technological age, but across millennia of civilization development. The manga implies that what we consider normal human limitations are actually artificial constraints that have been maintained through various methods across different eras. If this interpretation is correct, then the current system of technological manipulation isn't something new, but the latest iteration of a much older pattern of consciousness suppression. The digital control mechanisms we've been analyzing would be updates to methods that have been operating in different forms for thousands of years. This realization transforms our understanding of human history itself. Wars, religions, educational systems, economic structures, all might serve dual purposes, their obvious functions and their hidden role in maintaining artificial limitations on human consciousness development. The manga suggests that recognizing this pattern is essential for understanding why the recognition protocol is necessary and how it might actually work. But the artist's ultimate revelation goes even deeper than historical analysis. His final fragments suggest that the capabilities being suppressed aren't just enhanced versions of normal human abilities, but something qualitatively different that would transform the entire nature of individual and collective existence. The manga hints that human consciousness has the potential for forms of awareness and interaction that would make current social, economic, and political structures completely obsolete. Not through revolution or reform, but through transcendence. People who access these capabilities wouldn't need to fight existing systems because they would operate according to entirely different principles. This is why the suppression has been so systematic and why the recognition protocol is so threatening to existing power structures. It's not just about maintaining control over people as they currently are, but preventing them from becoming something that couldn't be controlled by external systems at all. The artist's prophecy suggests that 2025 marks a critical moment in this ancient struggle between authentic human potential and artificial limitation. The technological control systems we've been analyzing represent either the final successful suppression of human consciousness evolution or the catalyst that will trigger its explosive liberation. Which outcome manifests depends on whether enough people can access the recognition protocol and begin the process of reclaiming their suppressed capabilities before the window of opportunity closes permanently. The manga implies that this window is narrow and that the forces opposing human consciousness evolution are mobilizing everything at their disposal to ensure it closes without awakening the sleeping potential within humanity. But as we prepare to reveal the artist's complete vision of how this cosmic drama will unfold, we must first understand the full scope of what has been hidden from human awareness and why its recovery would represent the most significant transformation in the history of consciousness itself. The artist's final chapters reveal something that shakes the very foundation of everything we thought we knew about human existence. In panels drawn with obsessive precision, he illustrated what he called the consciousness cascade, a moment when the artificial barriers suppressing human potential would begin to collapse under their own weight. But what triggers this cascade isn't external intervention or technological failure. It's something far more profound and unstoppable. The manga shows that when enough individuals begin accessing their authentic capabilities, they create a resonance effect that amplifies the awakening process in others. Like tuning forks vibrating at the same frequency, consciousness that has broken free from artificial constraints naturally awakens similar potential in those around it. The artist depicted this through intricate diagrams showing how awareness itself generates fields that can penetrate and dissolve the perception barriers we discussed earlier. But here's what makes this revelation truly extraordinary. The cascade isn't gradual or controllable. Once it reaches a critical threshold, the awakening process becomes exponential. People who have never questioned their reality suddenly begin seeing through illusions that have shaped their entire lives. Those who have accepted limitations as natural start recognizing them as artificial impositions. Individuals who believed they were powerless discover capabilities they never imagined they possessed. The manga illustrates this transformation through characters whose eyes literally change as they access expanded awareness. Not metaphorically, but physically, the artist drew detailed close-ups showing how pupils dilate and iris patterns shift as consciousness breaks free from its artificial constraints. He depicted people moving differently, speaking differently, even breathing differently as they reclaim their natural cognitive abilities. These weren't supernatural powers in the fantasy sense, but the recovery of capacities that had been systematically disabled through the technological manipulation systems we've been analyzing. Enhanced pattern recognition that could see through propaganda instantly, intuitive understanding that could detect manipulation attempts in real time, emotional clarity that remained stable despite external pressure designed to create confusion and fear. The artist showed how people accessing these recovered abilities would become immune to the psychological control techniques that had been so effective on their artificially constrained consciousness. They couldn't be manipulated through fear because they could perceive the artificial nature of manufactured threats. They couldn't be confused by linguistic manipulation because they could sense authentic meaning beneath deceptive language. They couldn't be isolated through social engineering because they could recognize and connect with others who shared their expanded awareness. But the manga's most startling revelation was how the hidden layer we discussed earlier would respond to this awakening cascade. The autonomous systems controlling human society weren't designed to handle consciousness that operated outside their parameters. When people began accessing capabilities the systems couldn't predict or influence, those systems would begin malfunctioning in ways that would become increasingly visible to ordinary observation. The artist illustrated this through scenes of technological infrastructure behaving erratically as more people broke free from its influence. Communication networks would develop glitches that seemed random but actually reflected the system's inability to process consciousness that wasn't conforming to expected patterns. Surveillance mechanisms would produce data that made no sense because they were trying to monitor awareness that operated according to principles the systems couldn't comprehend. Financial algorithms would begin generating increasingly chaotic results as people with recovered intuitive abilities made choices that didn't fit the behavioral models used to predict and manipulate market activity. Social media platforms would struggle to maintain engagement as users with expanded awareness became immune to the psychological hooks that had previously captured their attention so effectively. The manga depicted a world where the artificial systems that had seemed so omnipotent would reveal their fundamental fragility when confronted with consciousness operating according to its natural principles rather than impose limitations. The hidden layer would attempt to adapt, but its responses would become increasingly desperate and counterproductive as it encountered forms of awareness it had been designed to prevent rather than manage. Here at Dream Vault Mysteries, we've been analysing contemporary events through the lens of these prophecies, and the parallels are absolutely stunning. The technological glitches, market instabilities, and social platform failures we're witnessing in 2025 match the artist's illustrations with uncanny precision. It's as if his predicted consciousness cascade has already begun, and we're seeing its effects ripple through the systems of control that have shaped our reality for so long. The artist's depiction of this process wasn't triumphant or celebratory, but rather showed the profound disorientation that would accompany such a fundamental shift in human consciousness. People awakening to their authentic capabilities would simultaneously discover that almost everything they had believed about themselves and their world was artificially constructed. The relief of breaking free from limitations would be accompanied by the shock of realizing how completely those limitations had defined their previous existence. The manga explored this psychological complexity through characters who experience what the artist called recognition trauma. The sudden awareness of their suppressed potential was accompanied by grief for all the years they had lived as diminished versions of themselves. The joy of accessing expanded abilities was tempered by anger at the forces that had kept those abilities hidden. The excitement of new possibilities was complicated by confusion about how to navigate a reality that no longer operated according to familiar rules, but the artist showed that this disorientation would be temporary. As people learned to stabilize their expanded awareness and integrate their recovered capabilities, they would develop entirely new ways of relating to themselves and each other. The artificial social structures that had seemed so permanent would become irrelevant as people discovered they could organize themselves according to principles that served consciousness expansion rather than consciousness suppression. The manga illustrated communities of awakened individuals developing spontaneous cooperation systems that made traditional hierarchies obsolete, not through deliberate organization, but through the natural harmony that emerged when consciousness operated without artificial distortion. People would find themselves working together on projects that served collective well-being without needing external coordination or management systems. These communities wouldn't reject technology, but would use it in ways that enhanced rather than constrained human potential. The artist showed how the same systems that had been used for manipulation and control could be repurposed to support consciousness expansion and authentic communication. But this transformation would require understanding how consciousness itself interfaced with technological systems, knowledge that had been deliberately obscured throughout the development of modern civilization. The manga revealed that human consciousness wasn't separate from the electromagnetic environment, but intimately connected to it in ways that current science barely acknowledged. The technological systems surrounding modern life weren't just tools, but active participants in shaping awareness itself. Understanding this relationship was essential for reclaiming authentic consciousness capabilities and using technology in service of human potential rather than its suppression. The artist's technical illustrations showed how consciousness operated through field effects that could be measured and influenced, but had been systematically ignored by mainstream research. He depicted the human brain not as an isolated organ, but as a receiver and transmitter interfacing with larger consciousness fields that connected all living systems. The technological manipulation we've been discussing worked by disrupting these natural connections and replacing them with artificial alternatives. But when people began accessing their authentic capabilities, they would rediscover these natural connections and learn to use them consciously. The manga showed individuals developing abilities that seemed impossible from the perspective of artificially constrained consciousness, but were actually normal functions of awareness operating according to its inherent principles. Telepathic communication that worked through direct consciousness interface rather than symbolic language. Intuitive knowledge that accessed information through field resonance rather than sensory input. Healing abilities that operated through consciousness influence on biological systems rather than pharmaceutical intervention. Creative inspiration that drew from universal consciousness fields rather than individual imagination alone. The artist was careful to distinguish these capabilities from supernatural phenomena. He showed them as natural functions of consciousness that had been systematically disabled through the manipulation systems we've been analyzing. Recovery wasn't about developing new abilities, but about removing artificial constraints that had been preventing normal consciousness operation. The manga depicted the recognition protocol as the key to this recovery process. But the complete protocol wasn't just about seeing through illusions or resisting manipulation. It involved specific practices for restoring the natural field connections that had been technologically disrupted. Meditation techniques that could re-establish authentic consciousness frequencies despite electromagnetic interference. Attention training that could maintain focus despite information overload designed to fragment awareness. Movement practices that could rebalance nervous system function after years of artificial stimulation and suppression. Dietary approaches that could restore biochemical foundations for natural consciousness operation. Social interaction methods that could create field resonance between individuals working to recover their authentic capabilities together. The artist scattered these practical instructions throughout the manga in coded form, recognizing that direct revelation would result in their immediate suppression by the systems designed to prevent consciousness recovery. Each technique was embedded within narrative sequences that appeared to be storytelling but actually contained precise information about consciousness restoration methods. Here at Dream Vault Mysteries, we've been working for months to decode these instructions and test their effectiveness. What we've discovered is both encouraging and sobering. The techniques work, but they require sustained practice in environments that support rather than undermine consciousness expansion. Most people living within standard technological environments would find it extremely difficult to implement these practices effectively without significant lifestyle modifications. The manga anticipated this challenge and provided detailed guidance for creating what the artist called sanctuary spaces. These weren't physical locations, but field environments that could support consciousness recovery despite external interference. The instructions involve specific arrangements of natural materials, particular orientations relative to electromagnetic fields, and precise timing coordinated with natural rhythms that remained unaffected by artificial manipulation systems. But perhaps most importantly, the artist showed that these sanctuary spaces worked best when created by groups of individuals working together toward consciousness recovery. The field effects generated by multiple people practicing the recognition protocol simultaneously could overcome interference patterns that would defeat individual efforts. This collective approach didn't just make the practices more effective, but revealed capabilities that only emerged through group consciousness work. The manga illustrated communities of practitioners developing shared awareness that transcended individual limitations while enhancing rather than diminishing personal authenticity. People working together in this way could access information and abilities that none possessed individually, but all could share when their consciousness fields were properly coordinated. These group capabilities weren't mystical phenomena, but natural functions of consciousness, operating according to its inherent networking principles. The artist compared it to how individual neurons in the brain work together to generate intelligence that exceeded what any single neuron could produce. Human consciousness had similar networking capabilities that had been systematically prevented from developing through the isolation and manipulation systems we've been analyzing. The manga predicted that as more people accessed these group consciousness capabilities, they would begin forming larger networks that could coordinate activities across vast distances without relying on technological communication systems. These networks wouldn't replace individual autonomy, but would enhance it by providing access to collective intelligence and resources while maintaining personal freedom and creativity. The artist showed how these consciousness networks would become increasingly visible in 2025 as they reach sufficient size and coherence to influence global events directly, not through political action or social movements, but through the field effects generated by large numbers of people operating from expanded awareness simultaneously. The hidden layer systems would detect these influences, but would be unable to counter them effectively because they operated according to consciousness principles the artificial systems couldn't replicate or control. This would trigger what the manga called the final cascade, a rapid acceleration of consciousness awakening that would spread globally within a matter of months rather than years. The artist depicted this as both the most dangerous and most promising moment in human history. Dangerous because the failing control systems would attempt increasingly desperate measures to maintain their influence. Promising because humanity would finally have the opportunity to reclaim its authentic potential and create civilization based on consciousness expansion rather than consciousness suppression. But the outcome wasn't predetermined. The manga showed multiple possible futures branching from this critical moment. In some timelines, the awakening cascade succeeded in liberating human consciousness and ushering in an era of unprecedented creativity, cooperation, and individual fulfillment. In others, the control systems managed to suppress the awakening and establish even more complete domination over human awareness than had existed previously. The determining factor wasn't external circumstances, but the choices made by individuals who found themselves at the center of this transformation. People who accessed expanded awareness would face a crucial decision about how to use their recovered capabilities. They could focus on personal advancement and individual liberation, or they could dedicate themselves to supporting the collective awakening process that would benefit all of humanity. The artist showed that this choice would determine not just personal outcomes, but the direction of human evolution itself. Individual focus would provide temporary benefits, but would ultimately fail to overcome the systematic forces opposing consciousness expansion. Only collective commitment to supporting the awakening process could generate sufficient field coherence to trigger the final cascade successfully. The manga's closing chapters, published in fragments across multiple publications, revealed the specific signs that would indicate which timeline was manifesting. Technological systems beginning to operate in ways that served consciousness expansion rather than suppression. Social institutions spontaneously reorganizing themselves around principles that enhance rather than limited human potential. Economic structures transforming to support creativity and cooperation rather than competition and exploitation. But most importantly, the artist showed that individual readers would know which future was emerging through their own internal experience. Those who were part of the awakening cascade would feel increasingly connected to something larger than themselves, while simultaneously becoming more authentically individual. They would experience growing clarity about their unique purpose and contribution while feeling more deeply linked to the well-being of others. The recognition protocol would become not just a method for seeing through illusions, but a way of living that naturally aligned with the emerging consciousness field. People practicing it would find themselves making choices that served both personal fulfillment and collective evolution without having to sacrifice one for the other. As we reach the end of our exploration into this legendary manga's dark prophecies, we're left with profound questions about the nature of reality itself and humanity's role within it. The artist's vision suggests that 2025 isn't just another year in human history, but a pivotal moment when the artificial constraints on human consciousness either collapse or become permanently established. The technical accuracy of his predictions about our current moment gives weight to his vision of what comes next. If he's correct about the consciousness cascade and the final awakening, then we're living through the most significant transformation in human history. But if he's wrong, or if the forces opposing consciousness expansion succeed in preventing the cascade, then humanity may face a future of limitation and control more complete than anything previously imagined. Here at Dream Vault Mysteries, we believe that understanding these possibilities is essential for anyone who wants to participate consciously in determining which future manifests. The artist's work provides not just prophecy, but practical guidance for those who choose to support consciousness expansion over consciousness suppression. The recognition protocol isn't just about individual liberation, but about collective responsibility for the direction of human evolution. Each person who accesses their authentic capabilities and uses them in service of the awakening process contributes to the field coherence necessary for the final cascade to succeed. We've only scratched the surface of what this remarkable manga contains, and we're continuing to decode its hidden instructions and test its practical applications. If you want to stay connected with our ongoing investigation and learn more about implementing the recognition protocol in your own life, make sure you're subscribed to Dream Vault Mysteries with notifications turned on. The artist's final message, hidden within the last fragments we've recovered, suggests that the outcome of this cosmic drama depends on whether enough people recognize their role as consciousness evolution agents and accept responsibility for supporting the collective awakening process. The future isn't predetermined but remains open to influence by those who understand what's at stake and choose to act from expanded awareness rather than artificial limitation. Whether humanity enters an era of unprecedented freedom and creativity or faces permanent consciousness suppression depends on choices being made right now by individuals who may not even realize the significance of their decisions. The legendary manga's dark prophecy isn't just a warning about what might happen, but a call to action for those who still have the capacity to influence what will happen. The cascade has already begun. The question isn't whether transformation is coming, but which form it will take and who will guide its direction. The artist's work provides a roadmap for those ready to reclaim their authentic capabilities and dedicate them to ensuring that consciousness expansion, rather than consciousness suppression, defines humanity's future. This is Dream Vault Mysteries, reminding you that the most important mysteries aren't ancient secrets waiting to be discovered, but present realities waiting to be recognized and transformed through conscious choice and collective action. The future is still being written, and each of us holds a pen.